Now we come to the main part of the talk today. Peter really needs no introduction from me because he's talked here so successfully in the past. He's also written a number of books. The last one he wrote was The King's Cross Story, 200 Years of History in the Railway Lands. He also had, before that, the Camden Goods Station, Through Time. He is the founder and secretary of Camden Railway Heritage Trust, which has been instrumental in really raising the profile of Camden Goods Station, really the site of today's talk. So, Peter, over to you for what we know will be a fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And I hope everybody is settled for the next 45 minutes. Perhaps encouraged by the subject to have a glass of some tipple. So this is the first time I've given this talk, and I'm hoping that there won't be many hiccups, and I do promise there won't be any more puns either. We'll start with having a look at the subjects we're going to cover. We're looking at how W&A Gilbey established their business, and why and when they moved to Camden, processes and the workforce, and then sort of later reorganizations and the move out of Camden. There's quite a few slides, so I'm not going to dwell on all of the sort of the busyness of the slides, just trying to pick up the salient points. So this describes a little bit the early years of Walter Gilbey. His parents, or his father, ran a successful stagecoach business, but the railway ended up destroying it. And he died very soon after. It basically sort of fell apart, which meant that Walter was really unable to complete his education and had to go and find some work. And later, he, with his brother, joined the Army Commissariat in the Crimea. And this is, I think, where his first sort of formative experiences really were. He got to play cribbage at night, which he was obviously very successful at because he bought his first horse from the winnings. He developed a great love for horses, and he also enjoyed wine, which he found in that part of Turkey. So these were two of his sort of formative loves, his wine and his horses. When he came back from the Crimea, his brother helped him to set up in business, importing wines from South Africa, believing that the low import duty would undercut the wines from the continent. So they set up and soon had a large number of customers on their books. And very soon after that, Gladstone really helped them by lowering the duty on French wines, which they passed on to their clients, whereas many other wine retailers basically took the extra duty as profit, or the lower duty as profit, and kept the prices high. So they moved into French wines, and they also took advantage of Gladstone arranging off licenses and allowing grocers all over the country to sell wine, which W&A Gilbey quickly took advantage of. They basically appointed grocers all over the country and made them set up an exclusive arrangement with them, whereby the grocers would only sell Gilbey's wine, but Gilbey's had such a large catalogue of wines and could get the wines to them so quickly that it absolutely enhanced the profitability of the grocer. So it was a mutually beneficial arrangement. Well, we're still really at the establishing a business stage, and here we see Gilbey's in the Pantheon, which they bought in Oxford Street, a famous old building, and this became their offices and showrooms for the next 70 years, and was obviously a premises which gave them a lot of status. They so as these premises became inadequate, they realized they had to move their bottling and warehousing operations, which was the sort of the mundane end of their business, somewhere else. And they were soon attracted to Camden Goods Station. They also became the largest drinks firm in the world. And as I said, by 1875, the excise duty they were paying was 6 times greater than that of any other wine and spirit house. Later, death duties caused them to convert their partnership into a limited company, and Walter Gilbey was created a baronet and became the chairman of that company. Here we see a little bit of the Pantheon and the original ballroom on the bottom left, which has all the sort of clerks' desks behind which the clerks were sitting or standing. They were either sitting on high chairs or standing there. We can see the boardroom right at the end. We can see the arches that led into the ballroom. There were samples and meeting rooms either side, which is where presumably people sat out when there was a ball. And also there was a large printing room, which was on the floor.
You'll probably quite like it.
Sorry, there was a printing room on the ground floor. This was on the first floor. And also a room for cork cutting and printing. And this is where there were some 40 girls turning out something like 40,000 corks per day. There were still basement cellars which housed the old ports and fine clarets. Eventually, these were found to be too dry, really, for the storage of such fine wines. Now, here's some figures on the growth of the business and some images from their various premises on the left. So by 1864, they were selling something like 500,000 gallons per year. And you can see that almost 3/4 is wine and 1/4 spirits. And this really reflected their early years, because later spirits increased to be about half of the consumption, which seems slipping. Which seemed kind of strange, that spirits should be drunk so heavily. But obviously this was a time when Scotch whiskey and gin were fairly popular. By then, sales had increased to 1.8 million, which is a sort of fairly rapid increase. And after that, they grew rather more slowly. And significantly, a larger proportion was destined for export as you approach the end of the century and the First World War. So the move to Camden was prompted by the various fires that had taken place at the shed, which Pickford's, the agents of the London and Birmingham and later the London and North Western Railway had occupied. Pickford's had fires in 1857, an enormous fire that was quite a sort of famous bit of destruction. And you can see people on Primrose Hill on the left there, gazing at the flames coming from Pickford's shed. And you can see horses bolting down Oval Road after they had been released from the stables. So that happened in 1857, and then there was another fire in 1867. And after that, it became a sort of open shed used as a potato market. The London North Western Railway were seeking a tenant that would basically adapt the store to their use. Pickford's by then had already found other premises. And here we can see it's an image, an artist's impression really, dated in 1890, a sort of schematic, which shows in 1890 what the main buildings that Gilbey's had in Camden Goods Yard were, starting with the A shed, which is the huge building at the top there with the large chimney. Opposite that was Gilbey's gin distillery. Nearer us, we can see the Roundhouse. We can see what they called Gilbey's number 2 and number 4 bonds. We'll be coming to these again. And on the left side there, you can see a triangular shaped bottle stores. So all of these were buildings that were either built for Gilbey or were already in existence and were adapted by them. And this, I'm not going to bore you with all the details on here, but again, we see the major premises, the A shed, the distillery, the Roundhouse, the number 2 and number 4 bonds, the bottle warehouse, and the number 1 bond and Catacombs. And we're going to be looking at those in a bit more detail when it comes to sort of the processes. I've also added the sort of former use of these sheds and what their current status is. So for example, we know that the Roundhouse still exists as a music venue and media center, and other parts also exist, like the number 1 bond and Catacombs, which hopefully one day will be much more accessible to the public. And this is the plan that was attached to the lease of 1891. So this was when their first lease expired, and they'd assembled all these buildings and they looked to renew their lease. And we can see here again the buildings that I've just mentioned. So the Gilbey A shed, which is in the bottom right there, now Lock House. Opposite the A shed, you can see C and D, which is the distillery and stables, B, C, and D. Then E is the triangular bottle warehouse, which is on Commercial Road, the yellow feature at the top. F is shown in red and is also partly uncolored. The number 1 bond, which is a series of vaults and tunnels through which Gilbeys were able to maneuver their barrels. And then G is the number 4 bond, and J the number 2 bond. And so you can see G, H, J there, partly in a sort of faded green. These were what became part of their export bonded stores. And finally, K, the Roundhouse. So that's sort of shows you in a plan roughly where everything was. A substantial part of the goods yard was taken up by their bonded and other warehouses. And here we see another schematic. This actually anticipated the new bottle stores that they assembled, and you can see the Gilbey stores at, just on the sort of bottom right there, a huge new building which had to be assembled from a series of other buildings, including the distillery, which we can see on Oval Road, as part of this new bottle store. We can also see a smaller building, which actually was the largest building in the area for many years, which is now I've forgotten the name of it. It's the Stanhope Arms, the Stanhope Arms. And the Stanhope Arms we will come back to, because although they bought it at the same time as they created these bottle stores, they released it back to the publican and didn't use it for another 20 or 30 years. We'll see what they did there. The A shed is on the bottom left, and you can see various other facilities, the triangular bottle stores sort of in the middle on the top right, and the other bonded warehouses there, which we will come to. Now, their engineer had urged the company to sell the Pantheon as early as the 1890s and to move the headquarters to Camden, basically saying that the Pantheon no longer influenced the minds of the present generation. But they kept the Pantheon on for almost another 50 years, only moving in the 1930s. We're coming here to some of the little information we have on the employment that that Gilbey's gave to people in Camden. Now, they when I went to the Diageo archive, which is where a lot of Gilbey's records are now stored, basically they didn't seem to have anything very much on the sort of employment side, except for a long row of conduct books. Now, I couldn't go through all these conduct books. There was so much stuff there, but I picked out one or two items from such conduct books. And it's basically about the way that a lot of employees took advantage of the fact that they were working among bottles of wine, bottles of spirits, and started to try and sift off some of this alcohol. And you can see here, for example, that in the second row, one of the foremen interviewed a guy called Birmingham. He stated he had a glass now and then, but drank little, although his replies were vague and almost incoherent, and his brain had obviously been seriously affected over time. And they really didn't see what they could do with him apart from encourage him to emigrate. And they eventually gave him £25 for a new start. Another typical punishment was, if it wasn't too serious and not a dismissible offence, they were transferred to bottle washing for 4 months, or something like that. They were basically demoted and given a job that probably was on piecework and not terribly well paid. Here we can see a group of Gilbey workforce. I think this has to be the foreman. There's some 50 here. We think that around about this time, 1890, there must have been at least 800, possibly as many as 1,000 people working in the in Gilbey's at Camden. in all kinds of occupations, as we will see. And a bit before that, there had been a period of decline in sales when they basically reduced wages, and obviously the employees suffered from this, and the employees had to sort of remind the company that conditions had got rather better, and could they now consider reinstating the pay for piecework and weekly wages. So there was a petition that was mounted, as you can see there, and Gilbey's response was to accept most of this request and to add an annual bonus to be assessed by the company, which was going to be based on actual sales. And this is a useful way actually of us determining how many employees there were, because you can see that based on some perhaps rather heroic assumptions about how the bonuses were shared, there must have been something like 400 or 500 people benefiting from this arrangement. And I assume that this doesn't include those that were on piecework. It would have been those salaried workers. So probably there were another 50, that was only 50% of the total workforce. Now I'm going to go through a little bit the sort of processes which I've called here a workflow for the domestic market. There would have been a similar workflow for the export market, but we'll come to some of those distinctions during the course of this talk. If we start on the right-hand side, we can see that empty bottles would arrive in crates, having been returned by the various agents around the country, returned by rail, returned by road, or by canal to the various unloading banks. The bottles would be inspected, sterilized, dried, and so on. And obviously there would have been some breakages, and so new bottles would have been added. And so the bottles would be then assembled in crates and moved towards the various places where the bottles would be filled. Meanwhile, timber needs to be assembled for repairing vats and for remaking crates and repairing them. So that was all part of that process. And on the left-hand side, the wines and spirits are shipped in by cask, either by sea, rail, or road to the various Camden warehouses. They're then held in bonded storage and moved to the A shed to be decanted into vats after the duty's been paid. So there would have been quite an operation of barrels moving to the A shed, and there in the A shed, they would be moved from these barrels into even larger, much larger vats. And these wine and spirit vats then were monitored, they were filtered, they were regularly topped up with reserves, and then finally, when the wine or spirits were ready to be bottled, they would be kind of taken off in pipes and moved, and the bottles filled, always from the bottom of the bottle to avoid oxygen entering the bottle, and then of course the crates filled with full bottles and corked and so on, and moved for then for packing and distribution. So we'll see a bit of that as we go through. These are not great pictures, but they're the ones we've got, and in any of the archives I went to. But these are certainly Gilbey processes. The filtration of wine in steel vats on the left-hand side. So that's actually now in the probably in the 1950s even 1960s, because all of those vats would have been wooden casks previously. We can see vodka being blended and filtered in the top center. And we can see a refilling machine for capping bottles of whiskey. And on the bottom left, these ladies are working on a production line, bottling, corking, and capping triple crown port at an enormous rate, 240 cases of 12 bottles per hour. And finally, at the bottom right, we can see coopers repairing barrels. Here we can see the A shed. There are some images of some of the vats on the left-hand side, and bottling floor and a sherry vault. We're going to see a cross section, so we'll get a better idea of what this looks like in but here we're looking at it on the right in plan. There are 4 floors, each of about 1¼ acres, with an acre of glazing. So an enormous building, some 40,000 empty bottles being washed every day. This was until a new warehouse was built for bottle washing, which we'll come to. Perhaps 350 hands employed in the building. And we can see on the bottom that there were railway lines running into the building and out of it, and a cross rail that was in the building, which had a loading bay alongside for picking up crates and barrels and offloading them, of course. And here we can see the center part of that building, which is called the general forwarding floor, where the crates are assembled and moved towards the various means of distributing them by rail or by road. We can see that there are 2 floors on the left-hand side, and beneath this general forwarding floor, there are 2 more floors. So we can see 2 floors here, but there are 2 below. We can also, on the bottom left, see one of the sidings that came from the other bank, the northern bank, or the northern bank where the goods yard is, and crossed a bridge into this A shed. This one is the western bridge, and we can see a loading bank alongside. Now, there's something like 100 vats arranged here on various stages, varying from 1,500 to 9,000 gallons. An enormous storage, possibly about half of the total storage that Gilbey's had. About 450,000 gallons. And here we see a cross section. Again, you can see the packing floor which we have just been looking at, and the 2 floors that are alongside it, one of which is divided into 2 anyway. So, and below that, 2 floors for wines and spirits, champagne and claret, and some images of the claret that is stored in the basement, which you can see from the Illustrated London News of 1875 at the bottom. So in the left, we can see the claret in casks, and in the right, it's being stored in bottles. So still with the A shed, here we have an image looking along the canal with the A shed on the right-hand side. Number 1, the chimney is rising there. There was a loading bank on the right there where the canal barges could moor and tie up, and the railway bridge that came across from the goods yard into the A shed is number 2 there. You can see some wagons on the bridge, one of which has Kodak advert on it. You can also see where the gin distillery was, which is number 3. And you can see what became the Gilbey House, and was then known as the Bottle Warehouse, William Hux's Bottle Warehouse, which is just jutting out as number 4. Number 5 is quite interesting because you can see a wooden staircase that is mounted on the outside of what is now Henson House and used to be the railway offices. So clerical workers would go up via this staircase into the first and second floors where they had their offices. Number 6 is a hydraulic accumulator tower. Number 7 is where the towpath has a ramped access so that horses that have been towing barges and been frightened by the whistle of the railway as it came over the bridge sometimes had to sort of took evasive action and jumped into the water, and this is where they would have been allowed out of the water. And beyond that, we can see the roving bridge and Camden Hampstead Road locks just about through the arch of the bridge. Now, this is the distillery. It was leased from London North Western Railway after Taylor's flour mills had been destroyed by fire. We can see on the bottom right-hand side a plan which shows that the distillery was to be connected with the A shed once they had built these new bottle stores by a series of tunnels. And these tunnels were going to be mechanized so that crates and barrels would be moved on conveyors from the distillery to the A shed. As I say here, this was started up in 1872, 50 years before really the boom of the cocktail era in the 1920s. And here we see some of the processes in the distillery. The botanicals included juniper berries, coriander seeds, angelica, orris root, and dried orange peel. And you can see various processes here for introducing these kinds of flavors, for storing the juniper, and for even sandblasting Gilbey's gin bottles. And moving on to the Roundhouse, we can see that this was an area which had an enormous storage for barrels, mainly of spirits and primarily of Highland whiskey. Gilbey's actually wanted to turn this into a 4-story building. They built the gallery, which we are familiar with at sort of first floor level. And they've got the ground floor obviously filled with barrels. But there could have been another storage area in what's now the sort of the basement. That would have meant taking parts of the floor away and creating the lifts to the basement. And then another floor above that. So I think we just have to be thankful that they were not allowed, or they found that this was too expensive. The other problem with the Roundhouse was that they found it difficult to control temperature. You can see the glazing in the roof, and all of this led to quite high evaporation losses, which they eventually tried to mitigate by some rather large casks, which they some rather large vats, steel vats, which they put there. Now, this is probably an area which a building you're less familiar with. You may or may not be familiar with what they call the gin house, which is a building that survives. It's the only part of number 2 Bond, which was this long, thin building with the coal drops running alongside it. You can see the sidings, rail sidings for the coal drops. And if we take a cross section through that building, you can see that it was used for storing enormous vats, 12,000 gallon vats, some 17 of them. And this was their export warehouse. And there would have been a hoist after they had bottled some of this, after they'd filled bottles and crates from these vats, that would have been lifted up to the floor above. And then they would have gone to the trains that were able to draw up alongside, and wagons that were used to transport the various wines and spirits for export to the docks. And below number 4 Bond, we can see what used to be called the Catacombs. The Catacombs was a name that Gilbeys themselves gave to this area, and it's a very confusing term for people now because they don't realize where the catacombs really were. But they're now part of Stables Market, and there used to be 2-way vaults. They're all just single direction retail shops now. But the catacombs are partly still there. They could be opened up eventually, and the public could enjoy what Gilbeys used for bottling, for storing casks, as we see in that bottom right-hand image, where they claimed that visitors were in danger of getting lost as they wandered around. This is just another picture of number 2 and number 4 bonds, the export bonds in 1876. At the top, we can see the 17 vats, and in 1976 at the bottom. We come now to the docks. So here we can see what a large part of London docks was wine vaults here. The wine would be taken off boats using the hydraulic cranes we can see on the right, and they would be assembled here on the quayside, where customs officers could gauge the casks and sample their contents. They had these shives or wooden bungs which could be taken out of the side of the cask so that the customs officer could sample them. Now, Gilbeys had the privileged position of not having to do this. Their wines and spirits were taken directly to their warehouses, where there were some 20 customs officers under the control of a supervisor that watched over the interests, the tax interests, obviously the duty interests, of Her Majesty's revenue. And as I said in the last bit there, that Gilbeys were paying some £1 million in excise duty when the tax revenue of the whole country was only 85 million. Now, some of the tax revenue was contested by Gilbey because the Inland Revenue allowed what they called a gallon of ullage. So when you had 100 gallons spirit barrel, 1 gallon was allowed to be absorbed in the kind of the wood or be evaporated through the sides of the barrel. That was 1 gallon that was allowed. But as far as Gilbeys were concerned, they lost probably 2 or 3 gallons. And so they felt that they were being penalized by the Inland Revenue. They could recover this extra 2 gallons that was absorbed into the wooden sides of the cask, but only if they kept using the same casks over and over again, which clearly created some problems for organizational problems and problems for cooperage. And adding water to, I try to extract the wine or spirits, that was called grogging. The gap at the top of the barrel was ullage. We're coming to the triangular bottle stores here, where bottle washing was transferred from the A shed. I'm not going to go into any of this, but this was later converted after the 1896 new bottle stores had been built. One of the reasons for doing that was to allow this to become the new export and general bond. And of course, the Inland Revenue required that the 4 arches, which were sort of part of this, which we can still see underneath the North London Railway, could only be approached from the stables side, not from this side. And I think this shows some rather nice images of some of the mechanical plant that started to be brought in after the sort of First World War, and certainly in just before the Second World War. Now, the number 1 bond was another underground area, so ideally suited climatically to storage of wine and spirits. It had been built for Bass the brewers. It was taken over by Gilbey's, and you can see that there was a barge landing point here. The vaults connected with a horse tunnel, and with the interchange basin, which we see on the bottom right. On the bottom left, we can see what an enterprising photographer was able to capture in 1987, the fact that they still had the barrel runs in 1987 and hadn't removed them some 23 years after Gilbey's had left the premises. I'm not going to go into this in very much detail, but you can see it from the plan on the right-hand side, and you can see from the plan on the right-hand side of Oval Road that it was a fairly complex business, assembling all of the premises that were needed to build the bottle stores. And these bottle stores were a building that allowed all kinds of new efficiencies in the operation that Gilbey's had. Yes, we'll come to that. Here we can see the bottle warehouse that they built. You can see the 6 floors that were originally built, and then when it was converted into flats, a 7th floor was added on the bottom left. And an aerial photo of that day, about 1921, you can see on the top of the building, it was essentially a timber yard and a place where carpenters operated, repairing and making crates. Some 25,000 cases made, perhaps 40,000 repaired each year. And the cork department eventually moved from the Pantheon in 1897. So that was when a few ladies joined the workforce. Number 5 bond, I mean, we looked at four bonds in Camden Goods Station, but the 5th bond was here at Camden Road Station, which can't have been terribly convenient. They leased 9 arches from the Marquis of Camden in 1876. When they finally built the bottle stores in 1896, they had to include their previous stables. That became part of the bottle stores, so they moved their stables under the arches here at Camden Road. And we can see our 2-horse dray outside Bonny Street stables, and we can see what the front of Bonny Street stables looks like today on the bottom right. And Gilbeys, of course, were, as a family, sort of interested in horses, and this 4-in-hand became a well-known feature, and you can imagine how irritating it would have been for traffic. And from looking at the middle picture at the top, with Bassy Gilbey making his way to his office in this 4-in-hand. And you can see it again on the right-hand side outside the A shed. And on the bottom left-hand picture, there's the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II with Winston Churchill in a carriage drawn by 2 bays from Gilbey's and driven by Captain Newman Gilbey. And the Interchange warehouse, when it was built in 1905, Gilbey's took over the basement warehouse on the right-hand side. You can see it as their sort of empty bottle stores. And finally, I mentioned the Stanhope Arms, and that was finally pulled down in the 1930s for Gilbey's to build a prestigious new head office. Obviously, they felt more prestigious in Oxford Street and the Pantheon, but they realized it was time to move to Camden, their head office to Camden. And so they built a rather sophisticated building with cork foundations and lots of light and special acoustics, so that they can just sample wines in the sampling room there. And now we're coming towards the sort of closing era. The lease was due to expire in 1953, and so they had a lot of debate about what to do, whether to continue in Camden or not. Part of the problem was that the A shed was becoming, I think, a bit decrepit, and I don't think numbers 2 and 4 bonds were working quite the way they wanted them to. So there were a number of options, and they decided not to saddle the future with the high cost of a new building, which would have taken a lot of planning permission and a lot of time for construction. So they negotiated at that time in 1953 for a new lease. But that was around about the time that I say the wolves were circling the company. There were other companies realizing that Gilbey's was a rather old-fashioned company run by a family, and were wanting to sort of take over the company or to amalgamate with it and possibly become the dominant partner. And that obliged to take another review, and which they did in the early 1960s. At this point, the A shed was dilapidated beyond economic repair, and they were invited to consider a site in Harlow Newtown, as long as, and this could be made available in the center of the town, as long as they put up a building worthy of the site. So again, they engaged some architects to come up with a rather fine premises, and we can see it in the top and on the bottom there. Later, they joined with IGV and independent distillers and vintners, and they, including Gilbey's, combined with Grand Metropolitan and eventually with Guinness, and merged to create Diageo. So there was a lot of change during the years in 1970 to 1990s. Now this complex that they'd put up on the right-hand side was only finally listed in 1992 when manufacture ceased. And this was obviously to prevent a supermarket in Harlow from being erected in its place, but they didn't succeed. And I mentioned finally that when I wanted to publish an account of Gilbey's Camden operations, the first thing that happened was I was sent a letter from their legal department. So they're still very fiercely protective of their inherited brands. I'd particularly like to thank Anne Eastman, who has helped so much, not only with this talk, but she is personally responsible through having been in editing the House magazine and being an important person in IDV and later parts of the Gilbey of that empire. She was responsible really for collecting the archives and passing them on to what became the Diageo archive. So she bears a lot of responsibility for us being able to create this presentation. And there are many other sources here, including the Gilbey archive in Bishop Stortford, which is far less well organized. The Diageo archive is a highly professional operation, but then it's run by a private company or a public company that's listed on the stock exchange, whereas the Gilbey archive is run by volunteers and charities, and they are only part way through basically and cataloging their material. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and be very pleased to answer any questions if there are any.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I'm sure most of us are really not aware of how much the Gilbeys actually covered on railway buildings on that site, and yet there's really no record of it when you go there today, which I think is very much a shame. There were a number of questions that people asked during the talk. Richard Cohen asked about, were the imports from Spain mainly wine or sherry? Do you know?
That's quite interesting. The Gilbeys, and not just the Gilbeys, but the other three families that became part of the sort of the Gilbey Empire, married into Spanish families a lot. So yes, I think that they did import quite a lot of wine from the Sherry region, and also from Tarragona and other places. So there was a sort of strong personal element, I think, in this, but I can't tell you whether it was mostly wine or mostly sherry. I should imagine that it was probably mostly sherry. Sherry was very much the drink, wasn't it, in those days?
Yes. Yeah. Right. There was one other question when you quoted that the excise duty from Gilbey's was £1 million when it was 85 million for the whole country. Was that all the taxation for the rest of the country?
All the taxation for the rest of the country.
So it really is quite an incredible sum that they were providing. Yes. And Malcolm Tucker was mentioned. If perhaps Malcolm, you could come in on this. You had a mention about the construction of one of the buildings. Would you like to?
Yes, I've unmuted myself. Gilbey's house, as I think it is now called, as converted into flats, built in the early 1890s, by William Huck. Was it Huck or Hucks? You wrote or said on one of the slides that this was on ferroconcrete, an example of ferroconcrete. It isn't actually ferroconcrete, which is reinforced concrete, concrete reinforced with steel. It was actually in the walls are of mass concrete, and then the internal structure is of steel beams and steel columns. So this ferroconcrete, I think, comes from English heritage, not understanding ferroconcrete.
Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification.
Right. Are there any other questions? Right. One of the things I would say, if you go on to the website for the Camden Railway Heritage Trust site, there is a heritage walk shown there, which is certainly interesting and worth following. So do go to look at that. If there are no more questions, can I just make one more announcement before finishing, which is that at the weekend, the Lauderdale House is having a heritage weekend with talks, walks, and on Saturday from 2:30 to 5, a lot of heritage organisations will be manning stalls there that any of the public can go in and look at. But if you look on their website, you'll see a number of talks and walks that you can join. I'll be representing the Camden History Society with a stall there. Thank you. But Peter, can I thank you once again for delivering one of your talks, which enlightens us in a way about parts of Camden that in some cases we almost take for granted or have changed. But I hope you will, like the rest of your publications, produce something on this as a publication that we can treasure too.
Yes, that's an interesting idea.
Yes. Right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And do remember the next talk is one you can actually come to at St. Mary the Virgin in Primrose Hill on the 30th of March. Come at 6:30, so you've got a chance to look around the church and see it in daylight, and then there'll be a talk at 7 o'clock. Thank you very much.